Hello and welcome to this episode 6 of the Pebble Inspector podcast. I am your host, James Gray, the Pebble Inspector-in-Chief, picking things up, having a look at them and putting them down again. This is my weekly digest of my writing experience, what I've written, what I haven't written, what I wish I'd written, how I think it's going, where it's come from, where I think it's going, and what I've been reading this week. I'm currently working on my dissertation for a Master's in Creative Writing and Literature Studies at Lancaster Uni. It's the start of August and it's due in on the 1st of September, so I've got a few weeks left, so we're on the final push. I have scuttled back under the duvet. Last week I was away on holiday, but still managed to record an episode. Sat in a very wooden kitchen, so the sound quality I think was okay. I managed to clean it up. But one thing I noticed is I use these very nice noise-cancelling headphones, which I mentioned in an earlier podcast, which are great, but the only problem is they block out all environmental noise while I'm recording, so I don't know what's going on around me as I'm talking, and only when I listened back did I realise there was a helicopter circling overhead for part of the recording. But hey, what can you do? So this week I'm returning to a piece that I covered in the second episode. It's the one with an inflatable skeleton haunting London, the death of Diana, and some autobiographical elements as well. It was the piece that I discussed in my final meeting with my dissertation supervisor, Owen, having shown him an earlier draft of it a couple of months ago. Came away with lots of notes from that meeting that I then wanted to put into the piece and start trying to build it towards hopefully its final form, and I can then get on complete the other pieces as well in time for 1st of September. As ever, we'll have some readings from the piece. I'll be a bit more selective this time. I think I read the whole thing last time, which is quite long, and I'll just pick out some of the sections that have seen the biggest changes, and then I'll also, as ever, discuss the influences that have gone into the piece. And as I decided the other week, I really should read from some of those influences, otherwise it's just me saying the name of random books. I didn't do any writing while I was away. I did some reading. I've been reading A.S. Byatt's Possession, which I mentioned in last week's podcast, and I didn't even read much of that, to be honest. Yeah, I did no writing. I feel like I've probably lost a week or so in being away. So sometimes it's good to have that break, and it felt good actually. I did a fairly solid day of writing, working on this piece the other day when we got back, and it felt good to get back into that rhythm. So hoping that continues. It's funny. I spent all of the other day working on this for about 8 hours or something, just noodling about with it, and I felt like I'd added loads. It felt like it had completely changed. It felt like not only a rewrite but substantial additions as well. But then when I compared the versions, I think I'd added about 500 words, but it felt very significant. And it's kind of interesting to look at, again, I've talked about this before, how there's almost a corporate or a productivity mindset around word count. You're always looking for a KPI, your key performance indicator, and the easiest metric is volume. It's how much have you produced. And of course you could just write absolute dog shit for 2,000 words, but it's still dog shit. Whereas, 500 carefully selected words is perhaps more valuable. And so looking at a day's writing that only produced 500 words in the context of it being a rewrite or a revision of an existing draft is far more pertinent. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, so the main takeaways from my meeting with my supervisor when he looked at the piece was that there was several things. One of which was that the skeleton is a really good image in that it's quite stark and weird, but it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't seem to have that much agency, and it's quite a surreal and almost silly image, which is, I guess, what I was going for, to lean into that a little bit more. We talked about the role of slapstick, how having absurd or slapstick or humour can elevate the emotional impact of writing alongside it. It creates a greater tension. If the whole thing is somber and serious and very real throughout, then you're not going to notice those emotional highs and lows quite as much, I guess. So the idea was to introduce a little bit more action. It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but just to get the skeleton to do something every time it appears. We wanted it to do something. So I kind of took that away and stuck it in the back of my mind and let that stew away. And I did agree that otherwise it just becomes a vignette or a diorama, I think is maybe the word. So the skeleton appearing and doing the same thing every time and not really changing and not really doing anything became a little too static, and it became this kind of vignette or diorama of, I should probably look up the definition of diorama before throwing it around, but I'm pretty sure it's there. So we wanted it to do something, and also to emphasize the otherworldliness of, or the very worldliness of it being a balloon, an inflatable helium balloon. I have a very clear image in my mind that it's one of those, kind of shiny metal, well, not metal, well, it is actually metal. I researched what it's made of. It's a thin skin of aluminium sprayed over a polymer underneath. So that's the image I had in my mind of this kind of slightly crinkly, but also taut, shiny, metallic balloon where the joints are formed by sealing off chambers of air. So the elbow is where it's been probably heat sealed to create a joint that then flaps around, and you have this kind of ragdoll effect if you're familiar with computer game physics. There's a crossover. So I wanted to introduce this physicality and appearance of the balloon. And I think actually the introduction of it doing something is a very good way of doing that. I could just describe the balloon in that way that I just have, but it's actually much better to show it. So to have the skin of the balloon interacting with the environment, and then I can show you the material behaving how that material does. So that's what I've tried to do. I will read a few little quotes that demonstrate that, hopefully, and then we'll come back to it. Oh, and so I'm gonna reread the opening passages because number one, because to remind you. Number two, no, I'm not going to number them. It's crazy. One, to remind you of the piece if you've already listened to the previous episode, but also because I've slightly rejigged the opening lines, so I want to see if they work, and also because I've introduced this action, more of this action into it, or more of the using action to emphasise the physicality of the balloon itself, because I refer to it as a haunting and an apparition and such throughout the piece, but to my mind it's a very real thing that happens, even though it's so odd. We're not going to, I never refer to the oddness of it, if that makes sense. It's just something that happens. Okay. Oh, and I think I don't know if I did a title last time, but it's now called She Wore No Crown, in reference to Princess Diana, because she was no longer a princess, but then also because it's a piece about other people who are very ordinary. She wore no crown. A 100-foot inflatable skeleton stalks London's mall. Slow and careful steps along pink tarmac, between plane trees and flagpoles, their banners draped untidily. Its joints are loose, a stringless marionette. The 10-foot wide rictus beams like a searchlight. The street is littered with petals and stalks, whole flowers. Some appear perfect, newly picked, others reduced by tires and feet, hooves, to a browning mush. Black sockets scan the teddy bears and devotional notes. The skull is topped with zirconia, refracting the thin light of an infant moon. London fans out in all directions, endless and silent. As the nights deepen, the first week of September is still sticky with summer. The empty streets ring. Knees and hips sharpen, lowering to a loose, unsteady squat. Tight and shining skinned fingers reach to pinch at a red rose on the railing. A single bloom among millions, wrapped in a cellophane cone. The rose drops to the road, rolling to a stop behind the stooping figure. Unfolding to stand once again, a breeze announced by the muttering of flags pushes it to an unnatural angle. Arms outstretched above the gleaming skull as though in a gentle, meaningful dance. The wind lifts car-long feet from the ground. The body rises above the stirring leaves. Slowly it inverts, outsized skull dipping below the barred torso, as 50-foot legs bend and tilt to an airborne handstand. The loose assemblage of femur and rib and skull, borne on the gathering air, bumps from wall to rooftop, knocking satellite dishes blind. Spiked aerials threaten puncture. Squeaking starburst creases bloom on taut skin. A fox barks, shrill and full of static. So I'll stop that one there. I think I noticed as I was reading then, one of the things I've been doing, which maybe explains why I've only written 500 words extra in all these hours of working on it. One of the things I did was to mess around with the line breaks of the opening skeleton sequences to create almost a lyric form, more like a traditional poem. And I started to wonder whether I should have all of the skeleton sections like this. I started to quite like how they were forming into a poem. I was reading them back to myself, reading them aloud, see if it worked, and I became almost convinced that that's what I should do. I stopped short because it's quite a long piece in total, and to have done all those sections as more traditional poetry, I think it would be very hard for them to sustain themselves over the length of the piece. I think it could become a little bit more tiring for the reader to sustain the reading for that long, and also quite jarring to go from lyric sections to more traditional prose. I think the entire thing takes the form of a sort of prose poem. I think my compression of language, I suppose, the way that I've tried to write it has had that feeling to it, or is perhaps a feeling I'm aiming for. One of the things that really helped in what I did yesterday was reading it aloud, recording it just on my phone, and then re-listening to it while I was doing some other stuff. And not only did it help me listen to the cadence and how that worked, but also just stuff that didn't quite work, even as I was reading it out loud, like I do when I'm doing this podcast. I notice things, and I notice more than when I'm writing them, so it's definitely helpful for that. But then listening to it back also really helps. There's a few things that I picked up on that I wanted to change. So it seems a bit weird. I was driving and walking around with listening to my own voice, but it's kind of psychosis that I think writing brings out in you. Okay, I'll read another piece of a bit more action. So this is the second appearance of the skeleton, and again, just trying to introduce a bit more almost slapstick, but treating it in a very serious way. See what we think. The following week, the skeleton once again tiptoes the kilometre stretch between palace and arch before being lifted into the moored sky, a crinkling fibula briefly snagging the carved sandstone plume of Nelson's hat, the column below momentarily draped with a glistening moonlit standard. The arms reach down to brush the bronze backs of lions before being blown clear and into the night. So, again, playing around with the geography and the physical world in which it inhabits. Which way is it going to be blown? What's in the way? Nelson's column's right down at the end of the mall there, after Admiralty Arch, I believe. I did a lot of looking on Google Maps because I ain't got a clue. You may recognise Mawed, M-A-W-E-D. It's obviously some sort of favourite word of mine because it appeared in a poem that I submitted to a few things. I think it went into, what's it called, Flash, the Lancaster Uni magazine. But anyway, to hell with it. It's my word, I'm using it. We'll have a couple more action sequences just to give you a flavour. The skeleton continues its weekly march. The nights have grown long, thickening as the year plays itself out. London has roused itself in the weeks since the apparitions began, shaking off the torpor that had lain like a heavy, stifling blanket over the entire country, the capital its last stronghold, as if proximity to an epicentre had some sticking effect. The night is once again populated by light and noise, voices and engines. For those that witness the weekly flight, it is felt to be the last vestige of a dream trace, seen upon waking. The few that try to discuss it are quickly hushed, as if trespassing. Even when ribs and spine and striated hands are seen tumbling from a tower block at the far northeastern fringes of the city. Those that happen to look from high windows in the surrounding flats, the sleepless and the day sleepers, if asked and if willing to tell, might have agreed it appeared to be lunging, trying to catch at the pigeons roosting amongst the parapets and satellite dishes, before toppling from the roof's edge, lifted by the wind, away from the lights and into the darkness. The mall remains empty after dark, an open-air crypt around which the city's vigil has dispersed. As with all hauntings, there is a pattern, tracing the same route from the palace, ending in a ridden updraft before the complexities of air currents take over. Only the arrangements of arms, legs, skull and rib cage varying with the wind and updrafts between high buildings. Some weeks it is seen splayed and cartwheeling over the skyline, others it is hunched and fetal. Always the glinting skull, star-like refraction of lights in its false corona. As winter roosts among the city's eaves, the offerings begin. Small votive gestures marking out where the skeleton's foot or hand or knee has brushed the ground. A handful of cheap flowers, sweets wrapped in shining colour, ribbons and buttons, small enough to be missed, swept up by the next day's feet and traffic, occasionally carried away to line dens and earths. Those are my sort of action sequences. Another thing that the reading aloud particularly demonstrated for me and helped me with was on things like repetition, which I think when you're writing that first draft or first couple of drafts, you don't really notice. It's only when you reread or read aloud or hear it that you realise you've said, in my case, it was dark and darkness, night, city. I repeat a lot, funnily enough. I mean, there's a reason for the repetition of those words. And sometimes repetition is obviously good, but sometimes it's just because these fragments were written at different times and therefore I'm not as maybe cognizant of that repetition. But then I'm also wary of having that, the thesaurus entering the chat. I tell you who does this a lot. It's like news reports tend to do it. The whale was beached on Sunday. And then it'll be like the large marine mammal. And then it'll be the grey-blue edifice. They can't repeat the word whale again. And sometimes I'm a little bit wary of that, and you end up with incongruities, I guess. One of the ones was because I sort of say skeleton or I say it, and I was wanting to avoid that. So the arrangement of arms, legs, skull and rib cage. You have the ribs and spine and striated hands. But again, this sort of trying to also feed into this, I want the visual picture of a skeleton, an inflatable skeleton, to really come across. Whether it works or not, I don't know. Moving on to another point of discussion with my supervisor was the anonymity of the piece, which I think I may have talked about before in my work. It tends to be very anonymous. Even though I've entered myself into this piece through the biographical pieces, where I talk about the death of Diana and my memories of it, it needed more. So it was the anonymity of the mourners, the other mourners. So there's people started to make a pilgrimage to the site of the skeleton or else laying votive offerings. But I just had it as this people started doing this, just generic people or the bereaved or the mourners or the bereft or whatever it was. But it felt a little bit too distant. I wanted a dreamlike quality to what was happening, which is what I originally thought I was doing by keeping it so anonymous. But actually all it did was kept too much distance for the reader, I think. So my idea was to enter... Initially, I had this idea of giving biographies to certain mourners. And initially, it was just, an elderly woman in a red jacket. So I built that up, but it still felt too anonymous. They're faceless. So I started giving them names. Then I started giving them surnames. And I started detailing who they had lost, or at least the relation that person was to them, and also the nature of their death. But I stopped short of naming the dead. So the only people that we know is Diana and then latterly my mum. But I thought keeping a rule, if that makes sense, like a structure that means that we know the name of the mourner, but we don't know the name of the dead. Kind of arbitrary, but also because they're the ones who remain and the remembrance is personal to them. You could read into it more, I guess. I'll read some examples and then we'll come back to it. The precise route shifts with the breeze, the circuit of devotion wandering like a river over a floodplain. Silent pilgrims are spotted on gantries and overpasses, trying to reach, to touch these sites of contact. Holding a ragged bunch of baby's breath from beside his wife's newly filled grave, Frank Oldfield stands dry-eyed and alone after 60 years of marriage, the final decade given to dementia. Beside him, her face almost lost within a fur-trimmed hood, Maya Novak holds football cards so tightly the edges cut her fingers. They belong to her younger brother, taken in a house fire she believes she caused, robbing them both of their childhoods. Across the road, Jack Mackenzie, widowed 2 weeks to the day, sways with his jacket half zipped around the screaming bundle held to his chest. Mothers, husbands, sons, any whose losses are so profound or so lingering that their grief has become chronic, those too tightly bound to their losses, those for whom grief cuts an untidy and ragged wound that refuses to heal, seeping and sore, easily torn, knots pulled tighter by time and struggle, desperate for a loosening through touching, offering, prostration, the mechanics, the precise formula never established, ad hoc liturgies improvised and unique to each. So that last section, mothers, husbands, sons, blah, 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 contains a few fairly major, to me anyway, changes. That section previously included quite a few different analogies for grief. We had the beating back of flames, we had wounds that wouldn't heal, a few others, and which I liked. I like coming up with these kind of different analogies of stuff, but it felt a little bit, you had to pick one. And my idea was this idea of you were bound too tightly to your grief, and I then wanted to expand on that. If you're bound tightly with thin wire or string, it's going to cut in, and those cuts are going to be seeping and sore, and they're not going to heal. And it also allowed this image of a knot and threads, which I return to later, and loosening. These are all words that I think are important. And also, if you struggle against them, they tend to get tighter, the knots. So that was quite interesting. And then also introduced the word liturgy, ad hoc liturgies. And I think the religious language that I use throughout it is also important. They're not religious. They don't follow major denominational religion in what they're doing. It becomes its own religion, but it's religion personal to the individual. I spoke about some of the titles I read as part of other modules, and I think this idea of personal religion really came through. Not that I'm religious myself, but I think the idea of humans needing ritual is really important. And so terms that I think probably I've borrowed from religion, and liturgies is one of the main ones. A couple more biographies of people just to see how they're sounding. Once the skeleton appears, its feet and shins glinting in the lamplight, its upper portions eclipsed, tumbling down the street, twisting to the wind, the mourners begin to animate, each one in turn, running, sprinting towards the heel or rising toes. Fiona Donnelly, a teacher unable to return to work after a miscarriage, unable to face children resolutely not her own, is overtaken by Ian Campbell, whose son was returned to him in a locked, flag-draped coffin. Each jumping as the phantom limb lifts out of the lamplight. They run ahead to anticipate the next footfall, hopeful, desperate for a glancing touch, for an arc of static between metallic bones of air and blood-warm skin. It's really hard putting names in. This may be why I avoid it. It's hard putting the names in because it's a failure of my imagination in to say, well, these people are not real, and I find it almost a little bit cringy in a way. I don't know why I cringe at it. It's just not something I do. Or maybe if I started with a single person, I would find it easier. It's just like plucking Ian Campbell and Fiona Donnelly out the way. And what I was doing with each of these is actually sort of Googling to make sure they don't already exist or they're not a famous example of that person. Why is, the former Home Secretary jumping at the skeleton? I suppose he could do. I wanted to make sure I was keeping it purely fictional. And there's also a sensitivity issue around it. One of the things I was doing was making sure that there was a range of relationships, making sure it wasn't just mothers and sons or fathers and daughters or whatever. It's you've got lovers and siblings. Well, that's mainly it. Lovers, siblings and parents, basically. I wanted to get that balance right. Same with the names. Once you remove a bit of anonymity, then there's an onus on the author to show what they're representing. And I suppose I'm looking at London as this big city, and like if you were, and it's people gathering from all over the country, I guess, who are doing this. I need to make sure I'm representative of that as well, without again it feeling forced. So I did a little bit of thinking about that. But we'll see how successful it is. One of the images I had as I was writing the original draft was I had so the skeleton haunting the city was one, and then once I got this idea of pilgrims or devotional stuff, I had this image of people silently sprinting down the street trying to touch it, which we've had just now. And another image I had was just of falling bodies, silently falling bodies. Again, not in like some great mass suicide, but just the starkness of that, and perhaps the way that they've given over their lives to grief, and to represent that perhaps by this acquiescence to falling and to death, that there is no sadness in that because their life has become kind of hollowed out. I did have a passage about lives being scraped out and hollow, which felt a little bit unfair maybe to people who are mourning. So I removed that, but I kept in this idea of falling bodies. And it provides more action. When I originally had talking about people falling and dying, supervisor felt that he wasn't sure if people were committing suicide or if it was accidents. So I wanted to make that more clear, that, and again, by introducing a small biography to the person who falls, I'm hopefully showing that it wasn't suicide, but there was also this, it ends on this note of acquiescence. Here we go. By early spring, bunches of baby's breath no longer hang from the arms of benches, and the first deaths are reported. Falls from rickety and shaky heights, trains and buses striking mourners as they crouch to lay another photograph or swimming badge. Grace Darling, a cleaner wearing a red wool coat to her knees, tired from her working week, loses her balance high on a fire escape, reaching to touch the bulging bone toes as they pass from earth to the sky. her only child, a daughter, dead of leukemia 29 years before. Her legs are not as strong as they once were. Dizzy spells leave her sat on clients' freshly made beds, drinking stale water from bedside tumblers. Had she fallen backwards, she might have struck her head on the metal stair edge, or winded herself badly. But she falls forward. Her body turns almost 3 times in the air before striking the ground below. Grace lets out no scream. So it's all sorts of high drama. And 10 points if anybody picked up on the fact that baby's breath, bunches of baby's breath, the flower, no longer appears on the arms of benches, because of course previous to that we had Frank Oldfield with a bunch of baby's breath from his wife's grave, so the implication is he has died, or perhaps has stopped visiting, who knows. I should say also that Grace is the only character with a name that is taken from history. So Grace Darling, who was a famous Victorian woman, she saved quite a few children from drowning. So I liked this idea that Grace Darling, the original, saved children, and Grace Darling in this story wasn't able to save children. And there's also a pretty horrible play on words of falling from grace and the way that she dies, which I'm not proud of, but it's there. If this bit sounds a bit weird, I had to record this afterwards because I realised I'd missed it out. Thank you, bye. We'll have one last bit of the mourners. Born years after the princess's death, Georgie Bell looks to the sun-abandoned west, to the fading skyline as it dissolves. She holds a collection of beads and bracelets to her mouth, whispering the name of her first love, left to bleed themselves dry by a stranger less than 2 weeks ago. She looks back to the unlit palace before stepping from the curb, to the centre of the road. Others remain still, as if stakes have been driven through their feet into the ground. His son, now grown and moved to a town far to the north, Jack Mackenzie sways in place. The timings are never exact, but those that have stood here enough times know that it has normally appeared by now. An hour passes, and still no one speaks, except for the usual low hum of chanted names, the invocation of the lost. I'm just now wondering whether the sun-abandoned west to the fading skyline as it dissolves. Well, if it's fading, we know it's dissolving. So we can just have the dissolving skyline, couldn't we? See, look, this is live. You are getting, you lucky few. So when I recorded the previous episodes, I did so without anybody knowing about them, really. There was like one person, and I was posting them. They were going up onto my website and then on Spotify and stuff as a result, which is grand. But I just wanted to build up this bank of them before announcing it, and knowing that announcing it, nobody's really going to listen. But anyway, I did that, put it onto my Instagram, and the stage I'm at in my what is hopefully a career, that's still just my friends. It's not like I'm followed by anybody who in the industry particularly. So it's just there's been a few people maybe have listened to it now. Maybe you're listening to it now. I don't know, who just know me maybe from like high school or worked with me 10 years ago, and they're like, what's this guy doing? Hello and welcome. Thank you for listening. But it's a little bit strange now recording this, knowing that people might listen to it, and knowing that it's slightly more public seems a little bit strange. But this is what we've got to do, isn't it? We've got to embrace the cringe. That's what I'm doing. Okay, that covers the skeleton's activity, so introducing action to the skeleton's behaviour, which then also allows us to explore the skeleton's physicality and material and the absurdity of the apparition. And then we've also looked at the de-anonymisation of the mourners and giving them their biographies and whether that's impactful or not, which leads on actually to further de-anonymisation, is that a word? To myself and the biographical element. So in earlier drafts I had biographical elements were me, I, my mum, our mum, and then the story takes a turn where I introduce a childhood friend of my mum's who ended up living in her house after my mum had died. And I just kept it as she and her, and it became a little bit confusing to know who I was talking about. I thought it was obvious, but it's because it's my story, so I know. The direction was to de-anonymise not only the friend, but then also my mum. Also, my instinct is to refer to my mum as mum. And also I had hesitance around protecting this friend. She's still alive, and so telling a story about her seems a little bit bold. So perhaps using pseudonyms, but then also just the emotional vulnerability of bringing my mum's name into this, and also that it's not squeamishness, but the discomfort around that, because not only did I never called her name, but it felt a little bit exposing. Same goes for, I refer to my sister in it, and if I stick to my structure of naming the bereaved but not the dead, apart from Princess Diana and my mum, I should name, well, not only my sister, but myself. Which then opens up this, because in the original version of this previous draft, I was in the story, I entered the story towards the end, but I was anonymous. I was a figure on the mall, I was another figure, another mourner, but since I've named all the other bereaved people, I am also bereaved, so I should also be named, as should my sister, which has been one of the most difficult, well, that whole section of naming my mum, this friend, my sister and myself has been something that I've really struggled with and played around with a lot. I named the friend first because I could just do that with an alias, and the emotional load isn't as great with them, so it seemed like a good first step. But then, do I give like my sister and my mum fake names? Do I give myself a fake name? If I give myself a fake name, then that whole thing becomes a little bit strange, and it actually makes the entire piece read as complete fiction, even though it may be drawn from my own experience. And the whole reveal at the end, where I'm holding photographs that I've previously described, which we realise are from my mother, that whole reveal wouldn't necessarily work. So, especially because the biographical bits are written from first person. If I, made up a name for those biographical bits, Johnny Billiards told his mum that Princess Diana had died, then maybe that would be fine. But I haven't, so I'm not really, and I'm reluctant to change it because it is written as a piece of creative biography, autobiography, whatever you want to call it, creative memoir, where I can take the truth and play with it, with this Princess Diana skeleton thing, and also some of the details, the biographical details. But ultimately, I still have a duty to the biographical element. Anyway, I'll read. So my decision was I would keep my mum's name real. And kind of for me, that takes on like an element of remembrance of her and naming her. At the moment, I've got my sister's real name in there. I might change that so I won't include those bits in the reading. But I think I will have to name her just because of the strictures of the rest of the piece and how that's structured. So I will have to name her, but I'll just decide whether I'm going to make it an alias or not. So I'll read you, see how it reads. As a child, when she was still just Debbie, Mum had a friend, Julia. Julia grew to resemble the princess even more closely. They stayed friends through school and enrolled at the same nursing college, their first jobs together. They stayed in touch, albeit sporadically, as each grew and started families of their own. Both divorced, though only Julia remarried, to be widowed a few years later. I collected Mum from the funeral. She was already reckoning with her own terminal diagnosis by then. Though for a year of treatment, she was well, or at least well enough to attend funerals. So you see, I've switched back to Mum in that section. That's because when I refer to her and my relation, it wouldn't sound right if I said I collected Debbie. I collected my mum. So what I've done, if I say Mum, I collected Mum, it becomes capitalised. She becomes a proper noun. If I say my mum, then it's a relationship rather than a name. And one of the other changes is if I say our mum, it's actually our mother, because it becomes more abstract at that point. It's about trying to differentiate those different roles that perhaps she played, I guess. Well, not played, but fulfilled. A couple more. There are almost no photos taken after the diagnosis. We had no wish to remember her as anything other than well, as if to record her undoing from the inside by unseen and silent forces was to concede an early victory. The boards at the memorial showed only a happy, smiling, and crucially younger Debbie, each preserving a much longer and often quite different future than the present in which it was displayed, from which she was omitted. And from which she was omitted, I think would be better there, wouldn't it? Oof, some more live writing. Crucially younger Debbie, each preserving a much longer and often quite different future than the present in which it was displayed and from which she was omitted. Any portent in those images, the preserve of those left to see it. Julia got in touch a few days after the memorial. She'd been there, but neither I nor my sister had had much time to talk to her. Even when I last saw her, she had something of the princess in her. The slight underbite, the blue eyes, her hair, even her careful and halting diction. A living waxwork, uncanny yet off, capturing the essentials but missing something crucial. A waxwork that somehow aged, showing us the almost face of a princess who was otherwise fixed in time. I think I could say the almost face of an almost princess. There's a little play on the fact that she actually wasn't a princess at the end. Of an almost princess. Look at this, you guys. You are honoured. Live writing. Showing us the almost face of an almost princess who was otherwise fixed in time. A glimpse into a distorted almost future. She got in touch to thank us and with memories of her childhood friend, and to ask us if she could live in Mum's house. Yeah. So I used Debbie, a younger Debbie, because in the photos, a lot of them were before we were born, so before she was Mum. So that's why I've used Debbie there. And then I use Mum again later on in the thing. So there's a differentiation. Let's see if I can find an example of the mother. The house was empty and Julia had sold her home, was looking to move nearby. Neither Sarah nor I could think of a single reason not to have this approximation of our mother squatting here in her once home. It was to be temporary and better her than a stranger. Julia had visited Mum at home when she was ill. The first time she had visited the house since Mum had moved there almost 16 years previously. So I've switched there between mother, Mum. I used a pseudonym for my sister in that bit, but you see how I've then switched to a name rather than my sister. Whether that could be confusing, but I think when we're talking about Mum's house, home, and living in it and moving into it, it's almost legalistic. It's almost kind of an estate matter, and therefore our mother feels more appropriate. Whereas when we're talking about visiting, then it's a personal thing. She visited Mum. She didn't visit our mother. That sounds too formal. And so what I had to do is kind of read each section where those things appear and see which one fitted best and which one to be happy. Because if I just said I'm always going to refer to her as mother, the whole piece becomes very detached and weird. If I only referred to it as my mum, then it sounds kind of childlike. But there are times where a childlike voice is perhaps appropriate because I am her child. And then, the final thing was to name myself, which is just really, really odd. Not least because I think a lot of people who know me, they always refer to me by my full name. And so using my full name in this just sounds funny because that's how friends would refer to me. So that sounds really odd. It's weird anyway talking about myself in the third person. It feels really grandiose, but it's crucial because I am just another of the mourners, and if I treated myself any differently in the story, then it would elevate me above them, which isn't true. The whole point of the story is the universal banality of grief. We all go through some form of grief and pain and trauma in our lives. The fact that we all go through it means it's unremarkable, but of course it's incredibly remarkable to the individual, which is where this idea of people struggling with it comes from in the story. So to then refer to myself, keep myself anonymous, or to do something different would mark me out. So I have to have my full name. I'm a mourner. If all the other mourners in the piece are named, then so should I. Could give myself a pseudonym, but that would make things really confusing. I could embrace that and just a complete pretense, but it just seemed a bit weird. So we'll see how it sounds. I still don't like it, to be honest, but I don't like it because I'm squeamish around using my name. I don't like hearing it, but whether it works, I don't know. So I'll start just before. The picture looked half posed, as if they'd been called up from lounging, impromptu sunbathing, to have their photo taken, told to shuffle together and look at the camera. The girl closest to the camera, the one in the navy shorts, is leaning in toward the girl in the tank top, adding to the sense of a hastily assembled arrangement. Their eyes, until recently closed, struggling to adjust to the harsh light the camera needs at the photographer's back. James Gray, the only figure remaining on the mall, does not howl or bay at the dawn. He does not look at the photographs of his mother as his thumb worries at a dog-eared corner. Already there is the sound of a city beginning to shake and maul itself into the day. The sound of street sweepers and bin lorries, reversing signals and horns, engines loud in the distance. He walks south, across the road, to the edge of the park, stepping over the low barrier and onto the grass. He walks between trees, through grass sodden with dew. Small leaves, fallen and brown, stick to the wet of his shoes. He does not keep to any one path, following instead a fall line, an invisible line of least resistance, through the green and mottled park, streaked with gallowed tree shadow, until he is no longer visible from the tarmac. So, third person grandiosity there. Yeah, weird. I don't know. I'm just going to have to live with that, I think, because I've backed myself into a corner with my own rules, and I can't be bothered changing them, and now I've got myself in third person, flipping, walking through a park. Great. Nice one, James. That's your finest fuck up yet. No, it's not a fuck up. Whatever. I don't know what it is. Yeah, there we go. That's pretty much it. The piece, I want to deal with a few different things in the piece. Obviously, it opens with this weird skeleton, and then it talks about Diana's death, and it all started from thinking about Diana's death and whether I could weave in a personal essay into that experience. But I was also sort of reading up on simulacra and simulation, the idea that we live in a world that is a simulation of what went before, and nothing that we look at or touch or see is actually the real thing. It's just this representation. in the way that the symbol on your phone for, if you want to call somebody, is a old-fashioned phone receiver. No phones look like that anymore. The way that save is a floppy disk, none of these things are real. In the same way that Diana's death became almost... Originally I was thinking simulation. I don't think it was simulation. I think, obviously the death was real, but we witnessed it through a very different lens. And then you had this public outpouring of grief, which sort of became a stand-in for grief that perhaps they felt unable to express previously. And then projection of grief, and then also this idea of history, historical events like that, whereas all these other people, their deaths don't get remembered, but Diana's does. So we're just trying to touch the coffin, touch the cortege, to tie our own little ribbon of memory to this historical thing, as if we might then get remembered down into the future as part of it, which is why we have this compulsion to enter ourselves into the story. You can remember where you were when certain things happened. It's like after COVID or after 9/11, rather than just being like, oh yeah, that was terrible, everyone has this story of like, well, yeah, we were going to fly to Gran Canaria and we couldn't because all the flights were cancelled. This is how it affected me more. This is how it's more my story. Started off with all those kind of thoughts in my head, and so then I tried to tie that together, but I don't want to be judgmental on the people who did have this public outpouring of grief. Like I said, my own mother was shocked by it. She didn't go line the streets or anything, but it had an effect on her, so I wanted to explore that. And then the foxes that I've got foxes appearing throughout the piece, and they're important as a continuation of life that really doesn't care about any of that stuff and doesn't observe these strange rituals, but perhaps rituals of its own, following the same routes through the city, following scents. They represent kind of renewal. This James Gray character at the end who walks off into the dawn also has a representation of renewal and continuation. In earlier passages I mentioned, having a child and how complexity of a child without a grandparent, but they are that continuation, and you then know something about how it felt to my mum as a parent to see the funeral with the children following the coffin and imagining her own child. There's all this kind of stuff, so hopefully that comes across. I am now at a place where I think I'm happy, or at least that sounded like I meant just in life, which maybe, I don't know, let's not get into that. I'm happy with the piece. I'm fiddling with it. That's why reading out loud is really useful. I found, like you've heard, I found several sections that stood out to me as slightly tripping over. So it's just little changes here and there, but I think I've got the main structure. It's like 4,500 words. My dissertation is 12,000 words total. So I've got two other pieces to make up those 12,000 words. So I'll let you guys do the maths because I cannot. They're all similar length, I guess. So in terms of that, I'm happy. I don't think there's anything more I need to add. Reading out loud and then changing the structure of it into poetry. I think I've saved the kind of poem version of the opening skeleton sequence, and I'll probably use that somewhere. I might throw a submission into a couple of magazines or competitions or something just to see what the reception is. I always like to talk about some of the influences that the piece has had. Because I've already talked about the piece, I have already talked about some of the influences. Mainly, I think I talked about Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with Feathers. And I still think that's very much present. This slightly, I guess, I really don't like the term, but magical realism. Mine's a skeleton, his was a giant crow. I still think his is one of the biggest influences, but I do want to sort of expand beyond that. But I will read a couple of quotes, because I think that's what was missing from some of my previous episodes, was quoting from my influences. So a couple of quotes I've picked out from A Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. Ghosts do not haunt, they regress. Just as when you need to go to sleep, you think of trees or lawns, you are taking instant symbolic refuge in a ready-made iconography of early safety and satisfaction. That exact place is where ghosts go. So this just felt relevant to my idea of a haunting and comfort, and when he talks about regression, symbolic refuge of ready-made iconography. So talking about iconography, regression, so to childhood, symbolic refuge. So I think there's a lot of that in my piece. Just another quote. I missed her so much that I wanted to build a 100-foot memorial to her with my bare hands. I wanted to see her sitting in a vast stone chair in Hyde Park, enjoying her view. Everybody passing could comprehend how much I miss her, how physical my missing is. I miss her so much it is a vast golden prince, a concert hall, 1,000 trees, a lake, 9,000 buses, 1 million cars, 20 million birds and more. The whole city is my missing her. Ugh. the is his, but also I could say at the end, isn't it? God, that's good. I went through and picked out some quotes, and this one stood out to me because it's so similar to my piece. We've got London with Hyde Park. The whole city is my missing her. So this idea of the whole city is a memorial. And then 100-foot memorial. So actually, yeah, we've got a 100-foot skeleton. He's got a 100-foot memorial. Like, oops, I didn't mean to copy you. I don't think I did. I can't remember whether I read this first or not. Either way, maybe it entered my subconscious. Vast stone chair. It's a very physical, architectural sense to it, which I've tried to come across with like Nelson's column, the palace and the arch. Yes, that felt quite relevant. I've also talked about, I think in reference to one of the other pieces I was writing, a heartbreaking work of staggering genius by Dave Eggers, which I've talked about a couple of times now. It is just so good. But I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from it. Again, his writing is very different to mine, but this tenor, I suppose, the tenor that he's going for of talking about yourself, really, and his final line, which I'll pick out, or not his final line, but the final line I'm going to quote from him, I'll pick out. See what you think. I like the dark part of the night, after midnight and before 4:30, when it's hollow, when ceilings are harder and further apart. Then I can breathe, and I can think while others are sleeping, in a way that can stop time, can have it so. This has always been my dream, so that while everyone else is frozen, I can work busily about them, doing whatever it is that needs to be done, like the elves who make the shoes while children sleep. I think it's the idea of nighttime and sleep and how that is this place that grief quite uniquely occupies or has more space to occupy. For me, anyway, I inserted the grief into that. We feel that to reveal embarrassing or private things, we have given someone something that, like a primitive person fearing that a photographer will steal his soul, we identify our secrets, our past and their blotches with our identity, that revealing our habits or losses or deeds somehow makes one less of oneself. It's a very long sentence. I think it's kind of pertinent to this kind of laying bare of putting myself in the story, using my first name, using my mother's name. Yeah, telling your story feels a little bit tricky, but I'm not the only one. Because secrets do not increase in value if kept in a Gorian lockbox. Because one's past is either made useful or else mutates and becomes cancerous. We share things for the obvious reasons. It makes us feel unalone. It spreads the weight over a larger area. It holds the possibility of making our share lighter. And it can work either way. Not simply as a pain relief device, but in the case of not bad news, but good. As a share the happy things I've seen, lessons I've learnt vehicle. Or as a tool for simple connectivity for its own sake, a testing of waters, a stab of engagement with a mass of strangers, which is lovely. I think it's really nice. But again, this idea of sharing being a useful tool, both sharing positive and negative experience and interpretation. And this final line that I referred to in one of the earlier episodes, but I thought it was worth getting the actual quote. And I think this is what these last few quotes are probably what I'm going to talk about in my critical reflection about life writing. If you don't want anyone to know about your existence, you might as well kill yourself. You're taking up space, air. Which I interpret as, if you don't think your story's worth telling, then life's not worth living. I spoke about in one of my earlier episodes about the struggle I've had with, like, why am I even telling people this stuff? It's so unremarkable as to be pointless. And maybe that's why I insert something like a giant inflatable skeleton or this giant turkey in one of the other pieces. Maybe I feel like nobody's going to read this crap about, me and my sad little life, but if I stick something mad in there, maybe they will. I mean, maybe that's a bit too close to the bone now. I don't want to... Let's not go down that route. But I think there's something there, isn't there? There's something in this idea of we all have these insignificant little lives and things happen in them and we choose to tell the story or we don't. And I'm just choosing to tell some of these stories, I guess. So a third book that I have to admit, I've not read yet, but it was it wasn't quite recommended by my supervisor, but he did mention it. So I started looking into it and it does sound relevant. I've always avoided it because I didn't like the title. And then I started reading some reviews and I'm not sure if I'm going to like it or not, but it's on its way and I'm going to read it. It's called The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. The title just really put me off. The Year of Magical Thinking just sounds like diddly-daddle, away with the fairies, which I'm not interested in. But I'm reading, a bit more about it. It's the magical element of it is Joan Didion, her husband died quite suddenly at home, just after their daughter was taken seriously ill and put into a coma or went into a coma, and then she subsequently died as well. So she had a lot of grief, and just as her book was coming out, actually, The Year of Magical Thinking, her daughter died. So kind of a tragic life. And the magical element is that when she was clearing out the closet of her husband's belongings, she kept his shoes in case he needed them when he came back. And of course, she knows he's not coming back. She's very pragmatic about that, but she still can't throw away the shoes. And that theme of the dead still living within us and still taking up space in our lives felt very pertinent. There was something one of the memorials that we had, my mum and the celebrant that we had said, what they have done is still done. And that really stuck with me. And it's true that the actions and the behaviour, the person may be gone, but their impact is still there, and that carries on. It's like a ripple effect. Elsewhere I've talked about grief being a Doppler. It doesn't recede, it's just the pitch changes as it passes. So perhaps it's not a ripple, the waveform maybe changes. Anyway, interesting. So a quote that I've found from Magical Thinking, which hopefully is relevant to my piece, and I'm hoping I'll get more out of the whole book, although I've read some reviews and it could go either way. Anyway, here we are. We are imperfect mortal beings, aware of that mortality even as we push it away, failed by our very complication. We're so wired that when we mourn our losses, we also mourn, for better or for worse, ourselves, as we were, as we are no longer, as we will one day not be at all. So I think, again, this obsession with grief, as in not just my obsession, but people's obsession with grief, or the reason it is so affecting, it does come back to the fact that it's not only the person that we mourn, but it's our own mortality that we mourn. And we know that this is going to happen to us as well. So it's interesting. Coming back to the reviews, you should never read the comments, you should never read reviews, especially not on fucking Goodreads. But there you go, I slipped, I looked. And everyone's like, it's amazing, it's amazing. And there's quite a few people who, I don't really know much about Joan Didion. Obviously, I'm aware of the book and aware of her name. She was, a literary star. She lived in New York. She had a very successful life. And the grief side of things is very universal, but her life is not, and her experience is not, and she doesn't really seem to notice that. So she talks about flying back and forth from New York to San Francisco or LA for dinner, and name drops various famous people who drop in for tea or whatever, and it ends up being kind of annoying for some people. So I'm interested to read the book myself and find out whether that's the case. I've probably now biased myself by reading that. So that's interesting. So those are my influences that I've been reading. What I'm going to do is I'm giving this week to this piece. Like I say, I think it's pretty much there in terms of its content. I'm just going to keep rereading and reading aloud and listening and seeing how I feel about it and making a few little edits. But I think I'm happy with it. And then next week I'll return to probably going to be the A to Z, which I've not done any work on for a while. So we'll see how that goes. And the week after that will be the Winter on the Farm piece we talked about the other week. Hopefully then that should leave me a week to do the critical reflection. It's worth like 20%, so I need to do something with it, but hopefully not my main focus. So that's good. That's the plan. I hope the few people who have started listening carry on listening. Please go back, listen to some of the other episodes. They're not very sequential, or they are becoming more sequential now because I'm now revisiting work that I've talked about previously. So maybe go back and listen to one of those. I should have said that at the beginning, shouldn't I? Maybe I can insert this. I can't be bothered. If you've just listened to this whole thing, maybe go back and listen to an earlier episode so you understand what I'm talking about in this one. I'll be back next Friday, hopefully talking about the A to Z, see how that's developed. That's it. Good luck in all your future endeavours. Godspeed, and bye.